You know, there are times in life when you honestly find yourself answering some really interesting questions. And as a historian and as someone who spends a lot of time looking into this subject, answering this question was particularly interesting. It really was. Mainly because there are issues. There are real issues in terms of modern frigates because there is the mirror, and there is the image, and there is the reality. Now, why am I saying mirror, image, and reality? Because the image is what we choose to reflect, what we choose to interpret and project to the world. Nations are consciously choosing the word frigate when they're designing ships. Frigate doesn't sound as scary as destroyer, it doesn't sound as an imperial as cruiser, and honestly, frigate is in many ways a return to what was traditionally doing the cruising role, which is an interesting factor to deal with for a few people to get their heads around. But leave that to one side. But saying all that, you have the mirror, the reflection. The reflection is a term which historians sometimes use. I'm not sure quite how widespread it is. I've heard exactly three other historians who were all professorish, but oldish professors, use the phrase in my life. And basically, by mirror, by reflection, they mean what does it look like most from the past? Because nothing will ever be a repeat of the past. As I've so fond of saying, history doesn't repeat, but if you look carefully, it does rhyme. What is the mirror? What are we looking at when we're looking at these ships? What are we looking at when we're looking at this period? What kind of period were they worried about naming of things to such an extent that what they were naming them was completely different to what they were? And honestly, we've been stuck in that phase since, I would argue, since the first naval treaties. Because they insisted on calling something which was 10,000 tons or less a cruiser, and then calling it a heavy cruiser and a light cruiser, when we all know they were light cruisers that they put it in. So, the French I actually have respect for, as I said before, because they have the first class and the second class cruiser. That I respect, because they're not trying to claim that either of them is a heavy cruiser. They're not. And then you have the reality. The reality is, what is you building once you get past all the spin, all the press releases, all the wider discussions? Modern frigates, cruisers by another name. Now, I did something on purpose here when I put this slide together, and I didn't mention live, and I'm mentioning it in number one and number four of the recordings which actually get uploaded onto the YouTube channel, and we'll see whether which one of those four will actually go live. This is number four, is the last one that's being recorded on the 1st of July. I think this probably will be the one that goes live. Probably. Usually, if we go back, down here, I put the date that it gets released on, which should be the 30th of June. And then I put its patron. Thing is, everyone heard me discussing it, everyone saw the date up above my head, no one brought it up. Now, probably because they're just being too nice. But the thing is, That got passed. We all knew that wasn't the reality, but everyone accepted the image, whether because they were nice or because they just didn't notice. And you can say they accepted the image because of the reflection. They weren't working against the reflection, they're working with the reflection because I always have it set up a certain way. People presume it is set up a certain way. So, cruising definition during the age of sail. Ah, fun times. So, normally referred to certain kinds of missions: independent scouting, commerce protection, commerce interdiction, and presence. The good thing about these missions is that they're fairly self-explanatory. The bad thing about them is humongous number of people forget number 4. Number 3 becomes raiding because that's so much sexier. Number 2 becomes convoys, when actually commerce protection could take a range of things, from convoys to counter piracy work to, you can argue whether counter anti-smuggling work is commerce protection or commerce interdiction. It's debatable, and debatable depends on perspective. Independent scouting. They also be used for the inshore squadrons quite heavily. Is that considered independent scouting? What is inshore squadrons work? They are operating fairly loosely coordinated, but they're still part of a squadron. And even when they're scouting ahead of the fleet, are they really independent because they return to the fleet? Tend to be running around during battles, acting as nursemaids and providing vital comms relays. Complicated. And presence. The amount of times people try and tell me this is a mission which doesn't exist in the Age of Sail. What do you think Nelson and the Collingwood brother who died, unfortunately, would have been a very good admiral, were doing in the Caribbean? We can all turn around and go, oh, they were doing counter-piracy ops, but you don't deploy 3 frigates of that size to go and do counter-piracy ops in the Caribbean. It's not that taxing. But you do deploy them there if you want to make the point to the French colonies and the various other powers in the region that Britain is very invested in the Caribbean. Britain is interested in the Caribbean. If you want to make the point to your own citizens and own colonies in the Caribbean, Britain is interested. Britain is aware. But you don't want to send a battle fleet. You want to send something which is a visible symbol, and preferably model them, that will remind people of your interest and your influence and what sits at home. But you don't want to send the expense of sending the thing at home because that costs a lot more money. So this leads us into our last point. Normally these roles were filled by 4th, 5th, or 6th row vessels. Often they are termed frigates, stoops, or brigs. There are barks, there are other things, snows, there are all sorts of other things used. They generally have single gun deck. They are generally armed with 18-pounders. In other words, they do not tend to be armed with the most powerful cannon in the world. They do not tend to be the largest ships, most powerful ships in the world. They tend to be capable of looking after themselves against an equivalent threat. But no, they're not expected to take on all singing, all dancing. They are not a battleship. And the interesting thing is, as we're getting into the points, it's when frigates become the battleships that the word cruiser becomes a ship, rather than staying as cruising. So it's when the frigates become the battleships that the cruiser appears. And you can see this quite clearly here. This is a frigate. This is a frigate. Trim Conley. It's a frigate. However, so is HMS Warrior up there. And HMS Warrior, without that, is a frigate. She's an ironclad armoured frigate. But she's also the battleship of her period. Let's be honest, she has armour, she has the most powerful guns. Yes, there might be first rates, etc., wandering around which have theoretically more guns, etc., but none of them can stand in line against her. She'd smash them all to pieces and still be sailing. She could outfight them, outmaneuver them, outgun them, outrange them 10 times every day and 20 times on Sunday. So she's the battleship. Which point she's now expensive. And you don't want to deploy her around the world unless you have to. So you build cruisers. Build this ship. And they evolve. This to this to this by the end of World War One, to this by World War Two. And they are incredibly powerful ships. But this is a 6-inch gun vessel in a world with 16-inch battleships. I.e., battleships with 16-inch guns on them. 18-inch guns on some of the Japanese. And plans for 18-inch guns are quite common. Most nations have an 18-inch gun vessel planned at some point. The British are one step away from ordering it. They're ordering the battle cruisers, which are the offshoots of the design, and then planning to order the battleships. These, barring HMS Warrior up there, are not the most powerful, biggest, baddest ship of their period. They do the cruising role. They are cruisers. They are not numero uno battle fighter. They'll be used to fight battles, and they will do a very good job of fighting battles. Sorry, I have a poodle who would like to fight a battle with a squirrel, but the squirrel always gets away. But they don't want to go and fight the battles. They're not supposed to go and take on the enemy battleship solo and win it and go, yeah, I'm the strongest. If they do find themselves fighting an enemy battleship, there better be half a dozen of them. Because what they'll be doing is the same as HMS Somali did, and HMS Seek did in her scenario. And whenever the tribal class destroyers encountered a battleship, charging them with torpedoes, because they're what they can use, firing their guns, trying to take out the unexposed things, because they're 6-inch guns. Well, they might as well be the tribal class 4.7s. They're not going to do any significant damage to a battleship. Before anyone starts pointing out to me and goes, but you always point out about the Deutschen class and the Grass Bay. They're a heavy cruiser, light cruiser, heavy cruiser. There is a difference. Again, they will do damage to a heavy cruiser, because most of the heavy cruisers do not carry enough armor either. Hello, where are you planning on going? So this is an age of transition. This is when cruisers come about and the cruisers grow. And one of the reasons why the cruisers become what they become, that bit's attached and has nerves. One of the reasons the cruisers become what they become is that the treaty system, which puts a limit on the growth, but also it's the constant progression in naval construction. It starts out small and grows. You know, we can take destroyers, the big 14,000, 16,000 ton ships you see today. They're massive ships, 10,000 tons. You can go back in time, you can take them all the way back and trace all their lineage back to the original torpedo boats of the 1890s, when they were a few dozen tons, let alone 100 tons. You can trace it back and go, ooh, hasn't it expanded? This is from 1982, and there have been many interesting responses to my quote and discussion of this, but I'd like to read this out. The designation cruiser indicates her principal task, which has always been long-range patrolling, and from this requirement flows her chief attribute of endurance. A cruiser must also be large enough to keep to sea in any weather, fast enough to be the eyes of the fleet, to scout in the shadows, overhaul the enemy in a chase, and powerful enough to overwhelm that enemy with her guns, though not so to slog it out in the line of battle against heavily armed ships. A maritime island nation like Britain, with vital worldwide interests, has always been peculiarly vulnerable to the guerre de course, the attack on her merchant shipping on which her life depends. Thus, the cruiser became commerce destroyers as well as commerce defenders, the weapon of both the weaker naval power and the stronger. In the Royal Navy, the cruiser has to fulfill both functions, performing her traditional task of protecting the country's merchant marine from interference, at the same time denying the use of the sea to the shipping of her enemies. To predominantly land power, cruiser warfare was also a useful secondary form of offensive. To maritime power, it was often, and of necessity, defensive. I'm not quite sure about some of those lines. Before we get into the top description, okay, I want to deal with some of the stuff from here. For starters, I'm fairly certain the Royal Navy used frigates first for commerce raiding and commerce destroying, before A, figuring out other people would do it to them, and B, that they would need to defend their own commerce. Frigates, if we look at them, there is a guy called Drake, and another one called Raleigh, who someone might be named for, and even a gentleman called Lord Howard of Effingham, who all do some very interesting operations. Very interesting operations with frigate built ships. I'm fairly certain those ships were doing what we'd call commerce raiding long before they started doing any kind of convoying. And to a maritime power, it was often and a necessity defensive. To a maritime power, it must be both offensive and defensive. It is their primary avenue of strength against the land power, against any power, is to block off trade. Because let's be honest, it doesn't matter how good your land infrastructure is, the usual is a large amount of stuff goes by sea. Doesn't matter if you have aircraft, even to this day, a lot of it will go by sea. It gets even more interesting once people go, well, there's all the cyber trade now, cyber commerce. It doesn't matter so much the stuff about the sea. Well, guess where all the cables go? Under the water, through the sea. They do. So there is a lot of commerce that needs to be protected. And again, people think Grey War is new. They think the whole idea of people doing nasty actions to each other while it's still peacetime is something new. It really isn't. It's been going on for a very, very long time. Hundreds of years. In fact, as long as there have been states, and probably as long as there have been groups of human beings, there have been people trying to undermine other people in peacetime before they actually declare war, because it's all called shaping the battlefield or shaping the battle space. Yes, we like to shape the theatre of conflict. That's the nice sort of phrase used. Basically, it means we like to set things up so as many of the bases are loaded in our favour as possible, which is fine. It's perfectly understandable in good strategic sense. But still, that means it's happening. So we can't change that. Grey War has been happening for a long, long time. And frigates have that role. Cruisers have always had that role in peacetime. They are both shaping the battlefield for you, the potential battle space for you, or shaping the peace for you, winning the peace for you, as well as potentially preventing your opponent from shaping the peace or shaping the battlefield space or whatever. So it all matters. And then let's look at the other designation above. Cruiser indicates her principal task, which has always been long-range patrolling, and from this requirement flows her chief attribute of endurance. So endurance is a part of a cruiser we need to look at. Okay, that's going to be a criteria we're going to have to think about. Cruiser must also be large enough to keep the sea in any weather, fast enough to be the eyes of the fleet, to scout in the shadow, to overhaul the enemy in a chase, and powerful enough to overwhelm the enemy with her guns, though not to slog it out in a line of battle against heavily armed ships. Well, okay. Various responses have come back from this, and me going, well, I'm not quite sure about Sumner's designation from 1982, because honestly, there are these jet things wandering around 1982, and people went, oh, but there's the American Surface Action Groups. There are American Surface Action Groups, yes. Guess what? The reconnaissance is still being done from the Carabala Group, but leaving that to one side, and there's satellites and other things. And you're suggesting that they're going to be hunting things with their Aegis radar with the cruisers, and which is a good way, by the way, to reveal your position to the enemy. You basically have all these powerful active radars, and you don't turn them on unless you absolutely have to. But leaving that to one side, no. This is supposed to be written from a British perspective as well. Lord Hill Norton, surprisingly enough, is British and a British admiral. The British definitely aren't using cruisers for that. I think it's almost a legacy of the pre-World War II thinking of the A to K line. I think he's copied out some things from the 1920s, 1930s manuals. In fact, I have a feeling I know which manual he's copied out from, and there is a chapter missing in the bit I've managed to get copies of from various archives and chapters. There's one chapter which I haven't got. And that chapter, guess what, is the chapter on cruisers. So I'm guessing it comes from that. So I'm reckoning by 1982, some of this stuff needs to be modified. Overwhelming again with our guns, though, does sound rather cool, but... So, from all this, what is a modern definition of a cruiser? Well, this is the starting point, and as I've said before, and planning something live, by the end, I might well have a slight difference from this beginning. But here is my starting point. Able to operate, to an extent, independently in the face of both natural and human threats. Ah, the joys of academia. Basically, and the joys of dealing with the world of Twitter. This is what it forces us. If I could say, I could write, able to operate independently in the face of both human and natural threats. I could write that. And someone come back and go, but what happens if the enemy turns up with an entire carry battle group? Well, no, that's not what you design a single ship to go and do. Well, then it can't operate independently, can it? If your enemy's turning up with an entire Gary battle group and all you've got is one ship there is a problem going on, and it's a lot bigger than that scenario, but we'll leave that to one side. Oh, the other one is natural and human threats. But what happens if a volcano blows up underneath it? Again, same point. If volcano goes off on the seafloor large enough and wide enough that and fast enough that it manages to emerge from the sea underneath and lift the cruiser out of the water, and the cruiser hasn't realized what's going on, then you have got far bigger problems going on, okay? But you can't write that because of the world of Twitter. And academia, because there's always someone who wants to prove they're smarter than you. It's really fun to watch some of them try. Some are. Some are really. The first thing you should always realize, if you're the smartest person in the room, you're the wrong person in the room. But if you're in a nicely mixed room, where you're neither the smartest nor the dumbest, usually you can tell the ones who are, in the latter category, because they spend their entire time trying to go up to everyone they think who's smarter than them and try and prove they're smarter than them. Usually in the most asinine ways. Anyway, able to traverse the world and able to act as a picket or command ship in a task group. And that's important. You need a ship that can be acted as a picket. You need your outer layer of defenses. You need your area air defense missiles beyond the position directly in the center of the task group next to your carrier. You need your pickets to be able to go forward. And I would argue that what we're dealing with, in some cases, some ships, is definitely an absence of that capability. Definitely an absence of that capability. And there's no really good reason for it other than we just don't want to spend money, and we don't need to, because, you know, the world's going to be peace and all the wars are going to be wars of choice from now on. A small rant might have appeared in the back of this book. I do admit that. A small rant might have appeared. They asked me. They originally, one of the books they were talking about to me about from Pen and Sword was to do a book on modern strategy and doctrine. And I might write that book someday. But at the moment, I want to write a few more history books. Before I start establishing myself as some sort of strategist and theorist, if I do go down that route, I want to establish myself as a historian. So I have a base from what for what I'm working from, rather than just jumping. And that's the interesting thing with these ships. The Ivor Hoodfelt class, often marketed as the most cost-effective frigates in the world. One of the reasons they're so cost-effective is because the Danish had the Standflex system, which they developed, which is a modular weapon system, which really does work. But it means that those, that, and most of those weapons in there, barring the Mark 41 VLS are loaded with standard missiles, which is 32 Mark 41 VLS with 32 SM2 3As loaded, are all modules. Which means whilst you, as standard, carry 24 Mark 56 VLS with loaded with 24 RIM 162 ESSM, that's Enhanced Sea Sparrows, basically kind of like Sea Scepter, a point defense missile, and 8 to 16 harpoons. Well, the thing is, you have 6 of those Standflex points. Each Standflex point can take 8 harpoon or 12 ESSM. So you theoretically could have had 4 ESSM systems and carry 48 Sea Sparrow. Or you could carry 4 harpoon sets and you could carry 32 harpoon. Or theoretically, I suppose you could load them all with guns. And it could be just be pop pop. But no, that's referred to mainly as the missile bay for the for modules, and that's what they keep doing. They also carry helicopter. They have the same radar fit as the Seven Provincian and the Sanction class. So the Dutch and the German navies enhanced air defense frigates. And honestly, they have a Smart L radar, which is one of those systems which turns up a lot. You start to realize that sort of some very this radar at the back. Some very powerful ships use it. The Seven Provincian class, Sanction class, the Ivor Hoodfelt class, the Dokdo class, amphibious assault ship of the Republic of Korean Navy, the Ivor Hoodfelt, as mentioned, the Horizon class, the Type 45 destroyer, the Queen Elizabeth class aircraft carrier. Now, in the Royal Navy and the Horizons, they're usually referred to as the S1850M, which is a modification. It's a variant of the Smart L. But totally, there have been 26 of these radar units built in various modifications, and they're considered a very good radar. They really are. All in all, they are really nice ships, and I have a lot of respect for them, and I find it very interesting that they are sort of a development of the Absalom class, which I would say are definitely on the cruiser spectrum. But here is what really pushes them. So they're capable against all things. They carry torpedoes. They carry a anti-submarine warfare helicopter. So they're capable against all threats. So that, and they've got a good gun on. They've got 276mm forward. All this gives them a good capability. This is what really sells them though as cruisers in my mind. They are capable of doing 9,000 nautical miles at 18 knots. 9,000 nautical miles. At 18 knots. The Abson class, the two of them, are primarily designed, you can argue, for command, support, and anti-submarine warfare roles, and carry, of course, their large ro-ro deck. These, well, these come with standard missiles, as mentioned, and that Mark 41 BDS can also take Tomahawk cruise missiles. Potentially. There's a debate as to whether or not they can actually take them, or whether they have that software or not. But I would say they probably do have the software, they just haven't bought the missiles, because the software can come as standard. You have to pay extra to get it removed from the system they bought. The fact is, the Type 31 is being based on this, and it looks like a really good ship, largely because it is based on a really good baseline design. The one thing I do have to say that annoys me is I wish that we had gone with the Stanflex system as well. I also worry about the namings, but we'll leave that to one side. The other Hoodfoot class definitely are in the cruiser part of the frigate spectrum. Right, the Frem class. The Frem had the potential to be, theoretically, a new Oliver Hazard Perry, or the Ander class. There were supposed to be 59 of them. There might be many more, because remember, technically the Americans are building 20. Before we get on to Constellation class, though, we'll discuss them. Italy 10, Morocco 1, Egypt 5, mentioned 20 American, and Indonesia 6. Currently active, well, Italy has 8, France has 7, Morocco has 1, and Egypt has 3. They come in a variety of variants, and including an air defense variant. And it's interesting to note that the French cancelled their 3rd and 4th Horizon class frigates, which is a problem because largely the Horizon class, and I get this when I'm talking to them, because they've only got 2, spend most of their lives being concerned with the Charles de Gaulle. That is their job. They are the big bad that takes care of the Charles de Gaulle. When they're not available due to some reason, it's amazing how often you see either a Burke or a Type 45, or occasionally even an Italian Horizon class shows up. Because if you're going to be operating a carrier of that status, you need something to act as its, I wouldn't say it's goalkeeper, because that's a good point defense frigate. Type 31 is being designed as I've often joked and mean quite seriously, looks a lot like a flak frigate, is pretty much being tipped up to be a goalkeeper for an aircraft carrier. One of those sitting next to a carrier or an LPD, and you've got a good chance of fending off anything trying to come through as your last ditch, because it can stick quite such a large volume of metal up into the air. Now, what does this large air defense frigate or destroyer do? Well, its job is pretty much midfield of the task group. There is nothing which gets past it. Its job is to intercept it long before intercept the ball long before it gets to the defenders, and make sure it's pushed back in your direction if you're the attacker. Frem class are interesting. The Frem class, 6,000 tons for the French vessel, 6,700 tons for the Italian, 142 meters long for the French, 144.6 meters long for the Italians. The French ones are slightly fatter by 30 centimeters, 20 meters to 19.7. But the Italian ones have a deeper draft, 8.7 meters versus 7.6 meters. So the Italians are longer and thinner by a little bit, which suggests a slightly more efficient hull design. The depth also suggests, again, they've gone for a more efficient hull design in terms of its stability and holding. But we'll see. You know, it's going to be interesting to see how these ships serve and how they are good for. Now, the thing is, that's a Frem here, and that's a Constellation. The Frems have a variety of weapons fits, and definitely I would say the GP variant is definitely sounding very cruiserish in its weapon fit and its duties. The ASW anti-submarine and air defense variants, well, I'd say they have the capacity to it, and they certainly are being used for it. The fact is, though, there's quite so many of them being built. Now, the Constellation class, though, let's be honest, they're supposed to be based on the Frems, but they're another 600 tons on the Italians. So the French vessels, 6,000 tons. These are 7,300. They're over 20% heavier than the French vessels. They have a similar power supply system, but they have a lot more weapons, but also a lot less weapons. And let's be honest, the superstructure looks pretty different once you start looking into it. What am I saying? I'm saying that in many ways, I would say the Americans have bought a hull and have stuck their own stuff on top of it. Which is an interesting concept. Because the whole thing was they were supposed to be going for a proven design that would cut down on development costs. And then they've developed a whole new thing. And, you know, its length, it's 151.18 meters long. It's almost 10 meters longer than the French vessel, 30 feet almost. Its beam is 19.81 meters. So it's slightly fatter than the Italian, but still thinner than the French and a lot longer. So its hull has been modified for definitely for oceanic operations. And when I say oceanic ones, I mean more efficient ranged oceanic. But it's capable of 6,000 nautical miles at 16 knots. And the Frem itself, well, depending on variety, it's 6,000 nautical miles at 15 knots or 6,800 nautical miles at 15 knots. It's again interesting when we compare it to the Type 31, the Ivor Hoodfelt, both 9,000 nautical miles at 18 knots. I understand what the Americans were looking for when they were looking for the Constellation class, and they put a 57mm gun on the front rather than a 76, which does have an impact on diplomacy. And when you're doing a cruiser role, and I know I get into trouble now because I've always been the one who goes, top trumps doesn't matter. Well, top trumps doesn't matter, but image does when you're doing the presence mission. It's kind of like when you're talking about capital ships. Yes, on paper, and if you're doing the maths, the 14-inch gun can be just as useful as the 16-inch gun. But you're going to have to explain that. Whereas your capital ship is the headliner of your nation. It's kind of like you going, you know what? In yeah, I'm trying to think. I'm going mentally through the Spice Girls, and I'm sorry I can't think of which one you'd sign. Basically, it's like saying you've got a musical and saying you've hired Posh Spice to do the singing rather than Sporty Spice. Okay? I only know this because I live with two massive fans of musicals, and I have taken them, and I still do not know their names, but I have just about learnt that if you're taking them to a musical, they like to see the what I would call Baby Spice, who I'm fairly sure is not very baby anymore, considering I think she's much older than me, and Sporty Spice. They do well in musicals. They're really good. They're really happy with it. If they saw Posh Spice, they'd be going, "Hang on, isn't she a supermodel, fashion designer, media mogul now? Why is she doing that?" You'd need to explain it. You're not selling it. You're not. It's not a statement. You need to have someone explain something. It's kind of like any scenario. If you were trying to tell me this glass looks big, looks great. If you try to tell me that this glass can hold almost as much water as this one, you would have to explain it to me. You would be wrong, but you'd have to explain it to me. Whereas if you're telling me this is bigger than this, it's obvious, it's self explanatory. This is a sexy handle. That's the point with the presence mission. Now, the 54A is interesting because honestly, it wasn't designed with a cruising or cruiser role in mind at all. It's got very basic facilities aboard for what we call diplomacy. There are some pictures. If you go to go to a particular Wikipedia page, there is a Rear Admiral Charlie Williams, commander of Task Force 73, speaking to Chinese naval officers aboard the Yulin, which is FFG 569 in Singapore. And yeah, it looks like a nice space, and having a nice space like that aboard such a small frigate is interesting. But mostly, this is a frigate for anti-submarine warfare, and it still has enough capacity for the cruising role. And it's as cheap as chips frigate, and you're looking at it and you're going, well, it's the Type 54A. There is, of course, the 52, which has gone A, B, C, D. This has been the 54, and then the 54A, the Yanghai 2. There is the 55. In many ways, the Chinese Navy are churning out escorts at all levels. They have their good medium all-rounder destroyer. They have their frigate for wandering around everywhere, less than 4,000 tons, less than $350 million. They've produced 50 of them. Yeah, they're not going to have a massive range. They don't need it. They don't need it for everything they're going to do. What they're going to do is provide the mass for task groups in terms of anti-submarine warfare. And they can do that. They're not brilliant. People, but in terms of technology, there's always debate with the Chinese. People go, "Oh, are they as good as us or are they?" It doesn't matter. If you presume they're as good as you, you're going on the safest path. You presume your enemy is less capable than you, and they turn out to be as capable or more capable than you. You've probably underprepared, and you're going to get your behind handed to you. If you presume they're as capable as you and they turn out to be less capable than you, then you're walking it. And if you presume they're as capable as you and they turn out to be more capable than you, then you're in less trouble. However, here is the reality of every war and every time humans have gone to war between peers and near peers. So listen closely, because I'm going to let you in on something which really shouldn't be a secret. Every single time, it has turned out that in some areas, one side is better than the other, and in other areas, the other side is better than the one. It's amazing. Anyone would think we were all human. So, leaving that to one side, there is also the fact here that they have enough of them that they are a lot cheaper to build than a nuclear submarine. And whilst, yes, you can go, well, we can take them out with what? Hypersonic missile? At $350 million a pop, it's almost cheaper to build one of these than is the hypersonic missile. Almost. It's not, of course. The missile is cheaper, but there are, when you're talking about development costs and all the other things going in, it does get pretty expensive. But how many of those missiles are you going to have? Okay, well, we're going to use a torpedo. Well, if you sink it with your torpedo, you're revealing your position. And it's kind of like facing the Flower class, or more correctly, probably the Hunt class escort destroyers. In that they are good enough they could sink you. If there are a lot of them in a pack and they're on active, and they're blasting the water with sound, they will probably detect you. But are they really worth you killing when you want to lust after bigger ships and taking out carriers and things like that? It's going to be an issue. But also, most importantly, these ships are present ships for the Chinese in the local waters. They provide them with the massive presence they want to try and offset the American the sort of global cultural perception of Pan-American power, which is always an interesting thing because it differs on what country you're in, and if you're in Europe especially, it's almost taken for granted that America is the big powerful nation. And yeah, we can shout and scream about America not liking what they're doing or something, but we know if push comes to shove, they've got our back, and we can depend on that same firepower we spent a lot of time decrying, because that's why we've been cutting the defense spending for years. Not without American encouragement in that regard, let's be honest. The Americans wanted a lot of very compliant allies because the Suez Crisis scared them, because two of their powerful allies went off and did something without their permission, theoretically. Now, the Fridtjof Nansen class. These are, of course, Norwegian vessels. And there was an interesting discussion on the live as to whether they are coastal battleships, sort of like ships, or coastal gunships, or cruisers. They are very similar to the Alvaro de Bazan class of the Spanish Navy, and therefore to the Hobart class of the Australian Navy, which are both vessels I would have no qualms of saying fit in the cruiser role. They have good all-round capabilities in terms of the weapons carried, but they don't really carry a lot of those weapons. One of the interesting things here is it's missing if we compare it to this vessel. This is the Danish vessel. Notice this radar at the back and this foremast. So they have the full set of radars and search radars and capabilities. This doesn't have that. This can have one or two sets of 8 cells of Mark 41 VLS, but they only carry Sea Sparrow, the short range point defense missile. So they can carry 32 to 64 of the missiles this carries here. Now, that's more than this one carries, but remember, it can load up to 48 just by quickly swapping things out, which is a lot easier than inserting a whole new Mark 41 VLS cell system, and that would require major work with a shipyard and cutting and rebuilding a ship. This is a module which just slots in and out. But that's also got 32 standard missiles. So it's got an area air defense missile. Carries 8 naval strike missiles. As we said earlier, up to 32. Normally 16. Harpoon. 4 torpedo tubes. A single 76mm. 2 torpedo tubes. 2 76mm. And of course, there's that lovely Millennium gun on the back, which is a close-in weapon system. Whereas this has sea protectors, which are Browning M2 HB machine guns. 4,500 nautical miles at 16 knots. Now, someone's probably going to point out the Lockheed Martin AN/SPY-1F 3D multifunction radar they carry, which is a good system. But the Ivor Hoodfelt carries, of course, the Smart L, which I discussed earlier, and the active phased array radar made by Thales Netherlands. It's an I-band system, and it's pretty good. Pretty good. It's probably... is it the equal of the AN/SPY? I would argue probably yes. Well, maybe not the exact equal in all performances, but certainly equivalently capable. Now, why am I bringing this up? Because of all the powers you can compare, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and Finland are possibly the closest in mentality, in force structures, in size, in styles of operation, and thought and strategic thinking. Yet there's a big difference. I'd say more in governments than in people. It's gonna sound strange, but I've always thought that Norway was let down by their government at the beginning of World War II, and that's why Norway gets taken over so quickly in 1940. Because the government just wants to stick its head in the sand and pretend the world isn't at war and there isn't the problems going on. And they won't listen to anyone who's saying anything else. And the Danish had the scenario that, have you seen the border with Germany? You know, I've done various discussions over how they could have held that, strategic and theoretically. And honestly, for the Danish to hold that border, they would have needed to turn the bottom 40, 50 miles of their country into a fortified zone of sea to sea, flat cannon, artillery, and concrete and bunkers, manned by most of their population. 24/7, full alert, everything. Why? Because the differential between them and the Germans is that great, but also the differential between their armed forces and the Germans is that great in terms of their modus operandi and their funding and support. The lesson for both nations seems to be never let it happen again. But Norway's built ships which are increasingly close to, and I did find it interesting that discussion of them going, are they coastal battleships? And I think they're still in that mindset of construction. And I think that's where that sort of ship comes from. So it's less cruiser, more coastal deterrent, more short range. Yeah, we've got firepower. We haven't got much of it though. Whereas the Danish vessels seem more designed for persistent operations and being able to operate around the world and being able to operate in the sort of threat. And there is nothing wrong with that. Please note. One of the things I find interesting with it is that how cruiserish a frigate will be depends on what ships that nation has and what levels of ships they have. Do they have destroyers, carriers as well, or do they just have frigates? And also their level of global interaction. Not their level of global commitment, their level of global interaction. I.e., are they doing regular deployments? Again, what do the Danish Navy do regularly? Well, they have Greenland to go to look after. And they also have good relations with Iceland, and so they wander across the North Atlantic. So yeah, having a ship which can sail 9,000 nautical miles at 80 knots makes a lot of sense under those scenarios. Horizon class frigate. Honestly, the difference between this and Type 45 is absurdly. Once you get boiled down to it, what you're looking at is a difference in terms of hull shaping, construction, and consideration about how they're going to be employed more than systems. And this led to its own debate about whether or not you can have a pan-European system. I always love when people go with a European rather than a NATO system, but we'll leave that to one side. I think actually having a NATO system would be more sensible because you could probably leverage off the American construction program then as well. But the sort of people go, oh, well, we could have a corvette which would be orientated around the Baltic and narrow seas and this, that. No. The thing about the Horizon class, what worked was developing the missile system, developing the radars, developing all those internal goings. The ship, the engines, the steel, the design, and the operation, that part nations want to customize. But they're often prepared to buy the radars, the other systems off the shelf because they require a very deep and developed infrastructure to develop. Now, yes, the problem you get into is threefold with any of these systems. One, strategic autonomy. If you buy a system off the shelf from another country rather than developing it yourself, you no longer have the ability to supply that if that country says no. You either have to build up a massive reserve of spare parts or you're in trouble. Interestingly enough, this was part of the argument given for why Britain used to be quite so... let's see. No, I'm not allowed to use that phrase. Not allowed to use that phrase. Not allowed to use that phrase by YouTube. Quite so dual-tracked in its procurement. You still always find them buying American equipment and European equipment. Because the idea was, if the Americans didn't want to do something, they'd cut off your supplies on American equipment. But if you also had the European equipment, you could still do the job. You'd just have to use that. And if the Americans cut you off, the Europeans probably wouldn't. Cute idea. Doesn't really work in practice, but we'll leave that to one side. This is your problem if you buy supplies. If we consider Russia, which we get into in a second, they have a huge problem because where did they get their gas turbines from? Ukraine! And isn't that causing fun for your engine procurement for your frigates and other ships? Ouch. Ouch indeed. So, Horizon class. 6,100 nautical miles at 18 knots, or 3,500 nautical miles at 25 knots. Top speed in excess of 9 knots. I would say both designs are pretty good. The Italians has 3 76mm super rapide guns, and let's be honest, 3-inch guns, that's a fairly decent armament, especially when you're considering naval 3-inch guns. One of the things about the Otto Malera 76mm, especially when it's got sort of the various ammunition, the Dart especially. Dart is this sort of anti-aircraft ammunition par excellence, but they weigh in at 7.5 tons. The 76mm. They have a muzzle velocity of 3,000 feet a second, or 915 meters a second. Their firing range with Volcano is 40 kilometers. With Sapama, 20 kilometers, and HE, 16 kilometers. Rate of fire. The compact is 85 rounds a minute. The super rapid, which it amounts fitted on these, 120 rounds a minute. 120 rounds a minute of 3-inch guns firing you. That's a lot of metal coming away. I like the 3-inch gun. Do I wish it was being fitted to the Royal Navy's Type 31s instead of the Mark 57? That's actually an interesting question. Because really the decision is between the 57 and the 76. I have a feeling if we were fitting the 76 rather than 57, which is proving quite popular at the moment, but I'm interested to see how it progresses. I have a feeling if we were fitting the 76 rather than 57mm, there would be a lot more discussion on the capabilities of those ships. There'd also be a lot more discussion in terms of the weapons we're fitting to other ships. For example, our aircraft carriers. I love them dearly. I have looked at their design many times, and whilst I'm not going to debate now the inclusion of the phalanx is, I prefer something, as we often said, I like the phalanx system, I just don't think the 20mm is enough punch anymore. I think the 20mm was enough punch probably when it was first conceived. But the fact that the designers and companies themselves have been trying for years to go, look, here's a version of a 30mm cannon, a 40mm cannon, even a 57mm cannon at one point, they were sort of going, shows you that probably the 20mm, it's fine at the moment, but no one's really tested it. As in, no one's been in a scenario where it's actually proved not enough. So therefore, it can still look like enough, so they're taking it. Remember that saying. Reality, image, mirror. To me, the 20mm phalanx is like the Vickers machine guns in the late 1930s. They were being fitted to everything. They looked good. When war came, it was quickly found out, no. Cannon, replace them with 20mm. And then 40mm. But no, the Horizon class, the fact that the NATO considers them destroyers, and France and everything consider them frigates, should tell you all you need to know about their capabilities. They most definitely sit in the cruiser category of frigates. The Ogorshkov class, well, they're cruisers by default. They're cruisers by default because what else does Russia have? People go, oh, they have the submarines, they have Udaloys, they have these. Those ships are of variable quality Utility and maintenance. No. They are variable. These ships are it. They have two, which are active. Gorshkov and Kastanov. They have Golbakov, which is theoretically sea trials, wandering around. They have for 5, which are super Gorshkov. These are very capable ships. They are rammed full of weapons, as is the Russian practice. So they're definitely capable against all comers. They look good. Haven't been inside one. But that really depends on the captain, how good they are inside. In my experience, you have a tradition with Russian captains, especially in small ships, they can maintain them and they do their best to keep them clean and keep them running. But you also, in the Russian Navy, have issues. But it doesn't matter. They are de facto it. Yes, the Russians have bigger ships for diplomacy missions. They have the Peter Veliky and her sister. They have the Kuznetsov, if it ever comes out of its refit. They have all sorts of other things. But the fact is, those things are all old. Very old. Falling apart old. And here is a lesson for everyone who cuts numbers and thinks you can keep doing the same missions. When, with less ships. You can do more with less hulls. You can, in theory. And then an accident crops up. An accident happens. And you have to change your system. You have to change your schedule. So ships get their maintenance delayed, which tends to make the problems bigger, which means their maintenance takes longer, which is going to muck up the schedule more. If you don't have slack in the system will find a way of creating slack, and usually it does it by disrupting your carefully laid plans. And you're not going to be able to deal with that slack because you don't have anything to take it up. This is why those people who study history tend to go, so how many deployments are you looking at? Okay, Royal Navy. You have roughly 7 standing deployments. Okay. Right then, wartime levels is 3-1. 1 on deployment, one in transit or training, and 1 in refit or how to put this? A refit as in short-term refit or long-term dry docking refit. There are two varieties of that. One basically decommissions the ship and then it gets recommissioned afterwards. So you need at least 21 vessels theoretically for those 3 roles. Sensible Navy goes, right then, we'll get 24. You built in some slack. You can theoretically do a field 8 roles. But also that means if one of your ships goes down, you have a spare. And you can always find something for the other vessel to be doing. They're not going to be sitting around twiddling their thumbs going, you know what, I don't know what I'm going to do and what I'm going to do. There's always something going on, like, oh, there is a Russian submarine heading straight towards undersea cables. Okay, where is our nearest frigate? Pulse. Right then, with that frigate gone there, it's had to leave its tasking. Right then, you are in extended training or da wherever you got those extra ships sort of built in the slack time. Go up. Thank you. Oh, this ship's been damaged. Oh, that's fine. We can still keep the schedules up. We've got spare. I was having a long conversation the other day about how many ships does the Royal Navy need. And the person I think was quite surprised when I looked at them and said, well, you could get by. Did I get it? You could get by with 8 air defense destroyer types, 12 anti-submarine frigate types, and probably 8 presence slash flak frigate types, and 8 sort of mine-sweeping, primarily drone support presence frigate types. That's 36. And that's combining the MSCV role into the escort numbers. So that's why the numbers are sort of bigger than the 24 earlier suggested. Gives you 36 vessels. Of which, let's be honest, 20 are 20 could be argued to be first-rate vessels. But the rest will not be. They'd be task group ships, not picket ships. And speaking of task group ships, we have the Baden-Württemberg class, which... Now, people are going to go, why haven't you put the Sanction class in? Why are you putting the Baden-Württemberg class? Because these are also called frigates. These are frigates which replaced the Brandenburg class frigates, and are sort of a development of the Braunschweig class corvette. Now, the thing is, the corvette I can forgive because it's armed with, well, the Germans have ended up building a second batch of them, which is fun, sensible, and fun. The corvette is armed with an Otto Malaria 76mm, some Mauser autocannons, and 2 Ram Block 2 20 launchers. So it's got CRAM as its sort of anti-aircraft air defense system. That vessel weighs in at 1,800 tons. Okay. The Baden-Württemberg weighs in at 7,200 tons. 7,200 tons. So this thing is 4 times the weight of the corvette. 4 times. It has a 127mm lightweight Otto Brera naval gun. Okay. Good system to have. With the right ammunition, that's got a very long range. With Volcano, it can go up to 120 kilometers. Useful. Okay. Good in the Baltic. Machine gun, remote-controlled 27mm autocannon. Okay. And 2 Ram Block 2 launchers. Plus it can carry Harpoon. Excuse me? It's 4 times the weight. 4 times the displacement. 4 times that of the corvette. And yet it has the same air defense setup. 7,200 tons versus, if I'm being honest, 1,840 tons. The corvette is 89.12 meters long. This is 149.52 meters long. It's got a beam of 18.8 meters. The corvette has a beam of 13.28 meters. The corvette has a draft of 3.4 meters. This has a draft of 5 meters. And it's massive in comparison to that corvette. And yet it has the same air defense as it. So, yes, this is a product of the we're never going to have to fight wars again unless we choose to, period. Off. Bye-bye. Sorry, I have books in here. And I don't like them off the deterrent. I can't have it on running while I'm recording a video, because otherwise it creates very weird noises for you all. The point is this. If you were using this frigate in the cruiser role, i.e. the presence mission, it's already immediately undermined before it even gets in the door. Because it doesn't look capable. Even the Norwegian one has some Sea Sparrow. If they'd made this ship with Stanflex, the Danes are next door. They're very friendly. They probably let the Germans use the Stanflex system for a reasonable fee. Then the Germans would have been quite able to go, well, yes, it carries this and this. And then if they needed to, they could have bought some modules and put in Sea Sparrow. That would have been what I'd have done if I'd been Germany in that period. Very easy way. I can buy the ships. As long as they have the space and modules, the upgrade and the installation is already paid for pretty much. I just have to buy the modules. But that means these ships are not able to do cruiser role. And it's not a top trump system. It's just a case of, yeah, turning up and being paid great isn't enough when you're doing the cruiser role. You don't have to be the biggest, baddest ship in the world. You don't have to be what we would nowadays probably call a cruiser to do the cruiser role, or to be de facto a cruiser. And that's what this discussion really is about, is the role of the cruiser, not the title of the cruiser. But you do have to be capable. And this doesn't. Just doesn't, okay? Alvaro de Bazan class. Oh. These are good vessels for the Spanish Navy. They are capable vessels. The fact that they cancelled one to Austria seems wrong to me. Especially when you consider her and Cristobal Colon were to be the slightly more powerful variants of the sisters. It was basically going to be a class of 6, of which 4 were quite powerful, and 2 were going to be, hello! We see the way you're looking at us. Yes. We're slightly more special than our colleagues. We just have a little bit more firepower, you know. We have 25mm rather than 20mm autocannon. Just a little bit. Just a little bit here, a little bit there. You know, not much. Just a little bit. But they're not massive. They're not got a massive long range, but they have served Spain well. And okay, I have it pictured on this direction for a reason. Them and the Hobart class, which are based off them, I have a problem when I look at them head on. There was a movie when I was growing up where the aliens had cone heads. They had a cone head. Every time I look at the front of these ships and the Hobart class from the head on, I just think cone head. I'm sorry. I am working on it. I am in ship visualizing anonymous meetings. We are having long discussions about it. We'll work through its group, its therapy. There are more than one. There is a lot more than just me in there. We will get through it. But from this angle, I can talk about them without cracking up because there isn't the case of their eyes and face of their sort of their forward-looking design and their forward structure and you see the eyes of their bridge and then the cone head rising from above. They are serious, capable combatants. They are very good. I'm not sure I would call them frigates. There is the interesting thing of, rather like with the Horizon class and the Type 45, there's the Hobart class destroyer, which is, yes, heavier and bigger than them, but yeah, it's basically them, but they've gone to the gym. So if you're saying that the difference between a frigate and a destroyer is that the frigate missed leg day, then are you saying your frigate is a second class combatant? Because honestly, this isn't. So you have to start. This is where I get into fun with the designations because you consider. I would say frigate should be a anti-submarine warfare orientated vessel. Destroyer would be an anti-air warfare orientated vessel, but both will retain significant general purpose capabilities, which is one of the reasons why, because of the contracting numbers, that all ships are basically doing the cruiser role these days because they have to, because you don't have any other ships to do the role, so they all have to do it. But when you're looking at a ship like this, you're going, do we really call you a frigate? Really? I'm calling you an air warfare frigate. Is that because Spain doesn't get destroyers and cruisers anymore? They just have frigates? Even though those frigates are getting jolly big and powerful? And then we have the Talwar class, which are the Indian Navy. They're quite interesting. They are based off basically the Admiral Grigorovich design of the Russians, which are the improved Kirivaks. Pardon me. They're good ships. They have good radars. They have good fire control. The Indians now have 6 in service, all home ported in Mumbai. 2 are being built in Russia, and 2 more are being built in Goa. It'll be interesting to see when they enter service and what they look like, because again, they're having the same issues with getting the spare parts because, of course, the war with Ukraine. Some unsurprisingly, after being invaded in 2014, Ukraine refused to supply more engines to Russia. As such, the Indian Defense Acquisition Council managed to, in August 2017, buy the gas turbines for the frigates from Ukraine, and they bought the frigates, the remaining, the Tushil and Naval class, which were originally going to be Russian vessels, from the Russians. They're also building 2 more, as said, in Goa. The ones in Goa will probably also, being built in Goa, will also probably get the Ukrainian engines. Although they're going to have a lot more Indian home-built equipment. So it'd be interesting to see how they work. But this is India developing itself as a navy, and they're a very interesting design, I would say. I would call them a bit of a blended design, but I also think they do have a... It's one of the things, there is this stealth frigate, and then you've got all that stuff on the top. And that's just... Seriously, that stuff, the superstructure, the structure above is you've built a stealth frigate, and then you've got that stuff on the top, all that gantry, all that stuff, which is going to create a massive radar return on your roof. And you always go, why did you bother? It's like on ships these days when we're looking at them and people go, well, where have all the railings gone? Where are all the walkways? Where are all these things that you have? And it's because they found they created such a radar return. So they're an interesting design, but they are being used more and more in the Presence mission, more and more giving India a voice. And again, people turn around and go, but India's always had a voice. It always has, to an extent, had a voice. But there is a problem, as I've said before. And this is misunderstood by some people, in that they do not realize this basic fact. You can be as powerful a nation as you like, but if you do not show up when a decision is made, you will have no voice in the room versus the smallest nation, the nation that does show up. If you want a seat at the table, you don't demand it, you don't shout about it, you turn up and sit in it. Which is what ships like this do. Yes, they're frigates. Yes, they're anti-submarine warfare vessels. Yes, they've got a tremendously strong air defense and other general purpose capabilities, which befits most modern ships because they can't really afford to be specialists because you have so few of them. You have an orientation, not a specialism. But yes, yeah, you have to do the cruiser role. You have to do the presence mission because it's that presence which gives you the seat at the table. And the seat at the table is where you get to have a real voice. You get the seat at the table by being there when they say, oh, dinner's served, or it's time for a meeting. Not by, you're having a meeting, you should invite me. You weren't here, sorry. Type 26, originally called the Global Combat Ship. I am sorry, but if anyone's trying to pretend that doesn't have cruiser, it's basically, okay, we're calling it a frigate. Yes, it's going to be a frigate. Yes, but we're calling it the Global Combat Ship. Basically, a modern definition of cruiser. If we go back to this lovely definition, go back right here to this definition. Cruiser must be large enough to keep the sea in heavy weather, and her chief attribute is endurance, long-range patrolling. Global combat ship. Yeah, which makes sense, and it makes sense the variants that are chosen. Let's be honest, for Australia, they theoretically have the Hobart class and the Canberras. So theoretically, they have bigger ships, so these can afford to be orientated around anti-submarine warfare. Reality, they have 2 LHDs, which can't take strike aircraft, and they have 3 air defense destroyers who are going to spend most of their life hanging around those LHDs in any sort of high threat environment because they're going to be their protection. Which means de facto that's what they need to be doing in peacetime as well. Which means in reality, they're going to be their present ships, which is why you have the Australians trying to cram Canadian level equipment into a British size hull. There were 3 hull varieties produced for the Type 26. We'll call them standard, expanded, and supersized. The British have gone for standard, as have the Australians. The Canadians have gone for expanded. No one's gone for supersized, which I find sad, but we'll leave that to one side. So, leaving that to all, the Canadians, knowing that this was all they were going to have, that their CSC was going to be their one-stop shop for everything, which is one of the reasons why, no, the Constellation class are not a good fit for Canada. Please note, they're not. They might sound it on paper. You might go, but we can build them for this price. But the reason the Constellation class costs so little compared to the Canadians is because you're having to rebuild all the infrastructure to build your ships, because you haven't been building them. So, of course, the Constellations cost less and the Type 26 in the UK cost less. We've got infrastructure which is already built and able to work. It's amazingly cheaper to do things when you don't have to retrain an entire generation of workers to actually build them. But leaving that to one side, the CSE is also going to be, unlike the Constellation class, a one-stop shop for everything. No, you will not have Arleigh Burkes. No, you will not have whatever comes after the Zumwalts and the Ticos and etc. and takes that spot. You do not have supercarriers. You do not have LHDs. You do not have all the pantheon of things the US Navy has that will go above and around the Constellation class. The Type 26, the Canadian Surface Command, is going to be your one-stop shop for everything. Of course, it's going to be expensive. It's going to be doing everything for you. It is by de facto a cruiser. And the Royal Navy? Why did you build the smallest hull? Because you're sort of like the Australians. Because let's go through this. You're going to have Amphibious Task Group North and South. You're going to have a carrier battle group, which may not be in the Atlantic. All of those are probably going to require some level of protection. Yes, the one in the south might well be protected by a Type 26. Cool. But your carrier battle group is going to require at least two of these bad boys, if not three. Probably three, because whilst in peacetime we can talk about borrowing from allies, in wartime they're probably going to have their own commitments, so you're probably going to be on your own. And again, it's probably going to be two of the Type 45s, and the carrier group North, the Amphibious Task Group North might also require a Type 45. You've only got 6 of those. So if you've got 3 operational, you're very lucky. Usually you're probably going to have 2 available, which means Amphibious Task Group North and the carrier battle group in any kind of fighting scenario are probably going to rapidly javoom and together, because then we can protect them. Which means, de facto, around the world, that Type 45 is already going to be pretty busy. So this is going to be your big present ship, which is going to come in after your Type 31s. They're going to be the consistent presence. So yeah, they don't need to be for that, but they're going to be the ones which are going to show up and going to go, so you didn't listen to my little buddy. That was sad. Now you get to see what I look like. You get an idea of me. Because again, that's naval deterrence, that's naval presence, that's a cruising motion. What happens? You send round the smaller normal cruiser, which is a presence vessel, cruiser, goes along. Hello. You don't take any notice of that? Okay, a bigger cruiser shows up. Something which looks a lot scarier. And goes, hello, shall we talk? And if they don't take notice of that, that's when a squadron might appear. And that would these days probably be either a surface action group, one of those amphibious groups, or the carrier battle group, depending on the kind of threat and the kind of message you want to send. So this has got a role in the Royal Navy. It's going to have a mission profile, and you're going to be able to watch the next 20, 30 years when they're deployed, and you're going to be able to go, was Alex right or wrong? You're going to see from their deployments, and I'm using history as my guide, I'm fairly certain I'm going to be right. It's a longer range bet than Bill Trump's normally does, but I feel quite confident in my grounds that that's how it's going to end up being used. And by the way, before you think the visits are going to be targeted on the exact poll to the people that they're worried about, no. What will happen is the Type 31 will visit one neighbour. Type 26, when it turns up in the area not long afterwards, will visit a neighbour the other side. Close enough, their embassies and very senior people can come see them. Far enough away, it's not a direct threat. Again, it's naval diplomacy. Reality, image, mirror. Reality, image, mirror. The triangle. The 7 Provincian class, the last on the list, and the Dutch. The Dutch. There's one ones I wish they built more. Again, the Dutch always undercut themselves short. But listen to this thing. It carries a 40 Mark 41 vertical launch nacelles with 32 SM2s or SM6s or SM3s. They can, well, they've been using their radar to support SM3 operations and tracking ballistic missiles using their fails-made Smart L radar. That thing on the back, the Smart L, which I've been talking about earlier, which is on the Iverhood Felts, and the Horizon class, the Type 45s, Queenswood class, and use that to relay targeting information to USS Paul Ignatius for SM3 engagement. They usually carry the SM2. Considering looking at upgrading to SM6, but that might wait for the next generation frigate, which is going to be designed jointly with the Germans. The Germans are trying to replace the Sunshine class from 2030 to 2035 onwards, so we're looking at the end of the decade. We'll see what they're going to be producing then. It's well equipped, it's well armed, it's got the lovely Otto Malera 127mm on the front. It's a good general purpose frigate. They can have 2 goalkeepers, as you can see. They normally only carry 1. Fitted 4, not with. Don't we all know that pain? They even have looked at equipping them with Tomahawk cruise missiles. They are good general purpose frigates, as befits Dutch and as they needed. So, are frigates, modern frigates, cruisers by another name? Yes, of course they are. They have to be. They have to be. Because cruisers are about doing the cruising mission. And the cruising mission is presence. It's economic warfare. It's shaping the battle space or shaping the peace. It's about being the eyes, the visibility part of your fleet. The eyes of your fleet, definitely, if they're carrying decent radars. All these ships have to be cruisers because that's their only option. If they're not cruisers, you're in trouble. You don't have your present ships because all you have are frigates and destroyers, and nations which only have frigates are even more dependent on their frigates being cruisers. So what's my modern definition of a cruiser? Capable of operating independently in the face of appropriate natural and human threats. Able to traverse the world, so sustain themselves. Have enough crew and facilities aboard they can actually do a long-range deployment. And able to act as a picket or command ship in a task group. That's an interesting thing to put in as a criteria, but honestly it seemed fair. Because that tells you whether that frigate is a cruiser or a frigate. If it's a frigate which can step up into the cruiser, it can't, it won't. Seems fair. Right. Destroyers. Come on. When you're building something this big and this many capabilities wrapped into one hull, these are cruisers. They are called destroyers. They are destroyers because they're orientated around the destroyer mission, as in the modern design. But they have to fulfill the cruiser role as well, because what else do you have to fill it? What else do you have that has the capability to fill it, especially in terms of the bigger present ship? It's got to be these. It's got to be. Right, what have we got coming this week? We have the Northampton class, because we're doing the US cruisers. That's fun. And what we have coming as live this week, we have the French 1920s and 1930s cruiser design doctrine. Hope you're going to enjoy that. Right, thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed it, everyone. And yeah, take care. Oh, I almost forgot. Question. So, what should the question be? Well, the question this week will be very simple. I asked in the live for you to design, as a question, to devise your own definition of a cruiser. Well, what I'd also like you to do, if you would like to, is I'd like you to pick a ship, modern ship, and I'd like you to decide whether it fits a cruiser profile or is it just a frigate or a destroyer. What it is. And I'd like you to say why you think it is, because this is what I want. I very much, I like my videos and I hope they get people thinking. That's what I do them for. I do them because I love them, I enjoy them, and I hope other people enjoy them, find them useful, and it gets them thinking. So I'd like you to, even if you don't put it in the comments, I'd like you to go and pick a ship at random, a modern ship at random. I'd like you to look for its profile, and I'd like you to make that decision as to whether or not you think it fits the cruiser role, or is a pure frigate or pure destroyer. If you put in the comments, that's great. That's going to start discussions, and I love discussions. But if you don't want to, I understand. Not everyone wants to do these things publicly, and frankly, no one's going to force you, because that'd be just rude, and I wouldn't allow that. But I'd like you to go and think about it. Thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed, and take care.